Hello, my name is Meg Huang. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Connected Health Policy. And today we'll be talking about what may happen after the federal public health emergency is declared over. Please note that today that this is being recorded, it is July 6th, 2022. Some of the information in today's video may already have come to pass when you watch it, or it may be a little bit out of date. A few disclaimers before we get started. Please note that any information provided in today's video is not to be considered legal advice. It is strictly for informational purposes. If you are interested in a formal legal opinion, please always consult with your legal counsel. Also know if I happen to mention a product or a company or show a picture of some type of device, know that neither I nor CCHP has any relevant financial interest, arrangement, affiliation, or relationship with such a company. So this slide shows you a basic sort of 100,000 level foot overview of the temporary telehealth policy changes that were made during COVID-19. So we have divided it up in the federal and state spheres. And as you can see, as far as the issues that the changes touched upon, there were some commonalities both on the federal and the state level. What the majority of these changes have in common is that they are temporary. Now, some of these changes have come to pass and been made permanent, or they've expired or been phased out, but some have still stuck around because we are still in a federal public health emergency at the date of the recording of this video. So the question always is, what happens then when that federal public health emergency is declared over? Because if it's declared over, theoretically, some of these temporary policies will then go away. However, changes have and moves have been made the past 2.5 years during the COVID pandemic to either extend some of these temporary changes beyond the end of the public health emergency, or they've been made permanent. We're really, for the most part, going to cover what's happening on the federal level. The reason is because the states have all done different things. So they are at different places. There have been some states that have made permanent changes, some states where their telehealth policy temporary changes were dependent upon the state public health emergency, and that may have been over quite a while. So for the most part, we will look at the federal landscape, but we'll touch a little bit, just sort of an overview of what's going on with the states. So with the federal public health emergency right now, it is effective until mid-July of 2022, July 15th. These public health emergencies on the federal level need to be renewed every 90 days. So the last one was done in April, so which is why we have an expiration date of mid-July now. Now, the anticipation is that there is going to be one more renewal, so another 90 days after this July one, or maybe a little bit before the expiration date. So it would take us out to basically about October for the end of the public health emergency. Now, there is a possibility, some are thinking that maybe the public health emergency may remain actually through the end of the year till through December of 2022. Part of the reasoning behind that is that the Biden administration did say that they would give states a 60-day warning on when the public health emergency is declared over. Now, the complication with that is it wasn't quite clear if that meant 60 days within a public health emergency 90-day window, or is it 60 days in addition to the 90 days for a public health emergency window. So that's why we have sort of, people thinking we're pretty sure we're going to get one more extension and we'll go through mid-October, but then there's like a question of like, do we get an additional 60 days because of the warning that was promised to the states? And then that takes us to the end of the year. So right now, a lot of people are looking at most likely that the public health emergency would be declared over in mid-October at some point, because that would be one more 90-day renewal. Now, keep in mind, and knock wood this does not happen, if something very severe occurs in that time, there is a possibility that we may have multiple public health emergency renewals because of just the environment or the landscape out there. But the general thought is that it would be renewed one more time. So we're looking at an expiration date of sometime in October. So these are a little bit more detailed policies on what happened during COVID-19 and what were the temporary federal telehealth policy changes that happened. And really, we kind of divided up into three big buckets: what was made temporary changes made in Medicare, temporary changes made for HIPAA, and temporary changes made for prescribing of controlled substances. There were obviously other changes made as well, but these are kind of like your larger 3 buckets for telehealth policy. And in some of these things, especially in the Medicare section, obviously there were additional other changes in there, but I've just listed a couple of things. And basically some of the major temporary changes included, at least for Medicare, expanding where telehealth can take place. So removing the geographic and site locations, allowing telehealth to take place no matter where you are located geographically, and also allowing it to take place in the home. Expanded who can be an eligible provider, allowing FQHCs and RHCs to be eligible providers, as well as a number of other types of providers like allied health professionals like OTs and PTs. Allowing audio only to be used as a way of providing service, a modality of providing services. With HIPAA, what we had was not necessarily a change directed by Congress, but something that was decided administratively. The Office of Civil Rights that oversees HIPAA basically said that they would exercise discretion in enforcing HIPAA. And that was in the early days to allow providers to utilize a multitude of platforms, some of which would probably not stand up to HIPAA scrutiny. So they would be able to pivot towards telehealth and provide services immediately or as quickly as possible in those early days of the pandemic. And then prescribing. Prescribing of controlled substances is controlled by federal law. It's underneath, it's a section that was in the Riot and Hate Act, which is why sometimes you will hear telehealth people, when they talk about this particular issue, say like, oh, the Riot and Hate Act. That's where it mentions what you can do with telehealth when you're prescribing over telehealth a controlled substance, and the telehealth provider has not seen the patient in person at any point in time. So underneath the Riot and Hate Act, there is a list of exceptions where you can use telehealth if that is the situation. And they're very limited types of scenarios, such as the patient needs to be in a DEA registered facility when the telehealth interaction takes place, or with a DEA registered physician physically with them when they are interacting with the telehealth provider. One of the exceptions, and it's in law, and this actually predates COVID-19, it was something in law before COVID-19 existed, was if a public health emergency is declared over. So when COVID-19 PHE was declared, that just automatically kicked in. But it is still temporary as well, too. So what I said earlier was that some of these temporary changes could have been made permanent. And what we've seen is like some actions that have actually done that on the federal level. Now, on the federal level, when you're talking about your telehealth policies, as we saw, a lot of that is really centered around Medicare, although there are other parts of the federal law and federal policy that impacts telehealth, but a lot of the telehealth specific policies is in Medicare. And a lot of those policies are embedded in federal statute, although there are some things that are more in regulations, which means that and the administrating agency has control over it, and they don't need Congress to act before they can do some things with it. So what we saw over the past 2.5 years are some changes that were made that would be permanent policy once the public health emergency is declared over. And some of it has been legislatively mandated, and others have just been administrative decisions that, in this case, CMS, the administrating agency, has decided that they are going to make this the permanent policy going forward. And what has happened with it is there was a Consolidated Appropriation Act passed in Congress in December 2020. And basically it said like the permanent policy for telehealth, once the public health emergency is declared over, is that for mental health visits, we're not going to have a geographic limitation, and it can take place in the home if certain conditions are met. So this would be a permanent policy change to telehealth. And once the PHE is declared over, this permanent policy would kick in. Some of the administrative actions that were taking place were done through the physician fee schedule. For those who are not familiar with it, this is basically CMS every year comes out with proposed changes to like how they're going to administer the Medicare policies. And basically they come out with their proposals in around July, and then they come out with the final versions of it at the end of the year, and it goes into effect the following year. And what they did was they addressed also mental health visits, but they said the changes that we're going to make is we're going to allow audio only to be a modality that you can use to provide mental health visits if certain conditions are met. And also, we are going to allow FQHCs and RHCs to provide mental health visits via audio only and live video. And we're doing that for the FQHCs and the RHCs by redefining what a mental health visit means for them. Now, that's important to know because FQHCs and RHCs, when we are not in a public health emergency, do not qualify as a eligible provider in the Medicare program. And that's in federal law. So that would need to be changed for Congress. And at this point, they have not changed it yet. However, CMS was able to change their policy on what a mental health visit means for these organizations. And they added into that definition the ability to use live video and audio only to provide services, these types of services, mental health visits, again, if certain conditions are met. So FQHCs and RHCs, while they're able to use this technology to provide these mental health visits, it's not considered telehealth. They are not considered distant site providers. It's because it's been a redefinition of a visit. Additionally, what CMS was able to do without having to wait for Congress is determining what services can be provided via telehealth and that they would reimburse for. During COVID-19, there was this huge temporary list of a bunch of other services that they said, in addition to our permanent telehealth list, which you can provide via telehealth and we will pay during the public health emergency. They created a temporary holding bucket for some of those temporary services and said, for these particular codes and services, we will allow them to stick around until the end of 2023, so they can be provided via telehealth and the program will reimburse for it, regardless of whether there's a public health emergency. So we know there are some services at least still being able to be provided via telehealth through the end of 2023. That is temporary, but if the public health emergency was declared over tomorrow, then these services will not go away, unlike other services that are not on the permanent list or in this temporary bucket. Now, additional legislation was passed earlier this year, just a couple of months ago. It was actually the 2022 federal budget. And what it said in there was that for some of the temporary public health emergency waivers, we're going to allow them to stick around 151 days after the public health emergency is declared over. So what would these policies be? Well, basically, they said that they will allow certain providers to continue to provide services. And those providers were FQHCs, RHCs, and those allied health professionals I was talking about, like VOTs and the PTs. And they would still be able to, even with the public health emergency declared over, to provide services underneath the Medicare program via telehealth and still get reimbursed for it during that, what I call a grace period. Now, keep in mind though, they did not delay some, or they did not put in this grace period some of the other temporary changes as well too, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what they also did in here was, I talked about what happened with Consolidated Appropriation Act from 2020 in like allowing mental health visits to be expanded and be provided in without the geographic limitation, and also providing the home if certain conditions were met. They said that would also be delayed. That permanent policy would also be delayed during that 151-day grace period. Now, what they didn't say was would be included in the 151-day grace period is that they did name specific providers, so not all the providers would be allowed. So right now during the public health emergency, it's all eligible providers in Medicare can use telehealth provide services. They did not say all of those providers would be able to. They did have, a list, and it was kind of more of like the usual folks that we see providing telehealth, or were providing telehealth during the public health emergency, but it wasn't everyone. They also did not touch upon the controlled substances relaxation. As I said earlier, that was not something that technically had to be done by Congress or by CMS when COVID-19 was declared. That was already in federal law. That exception kicked in. There was no talk about extending that in any way. So that could automatically go away and does not stay in that 151 grace period. And there was no mention about HIPAA either. So HIPAA, again, was something when COVID-19 hit, was an administrative decision. OCR, Office of Civil Rights, decided to make that decision. They did not have a direction from Congress as well. So part of these things may be because Congress didn't feel like they needed to act, that they would allow the administrating agency to act over those particular changes, or that they were not changing what was like prior existing laws, such as the Ryan Haight Act on prescribing controlled substances. So keep in mind, not everything is going to still be around. Those temporary telehealth policies, not all of those things are going to be around in this 151 grace day period. Now, what are the states doing? As I said earlier, actually, a lot of states, some of their telehealth temporary policies may have already rolled back because it could have been tied to the state public health emergency and that expired, or it had a specific expiration date. So states are a little bit all over the place. So some of them have already decided on, well, this is going to be our permanent policy going forward, or until we like change it later. So it's not tied to a PHE anymore. Some states did tie it to the federal PHE. So right now they're in that sort of that limbo phase, waiting to see what happens with the federal PHE. So there's still some states that do have their telehealth temporary waivers tied to that. California was one of those, but California did put like the hard and fast date on it later, which is again, what some states have done is that they put out a expiration date that was later on. California, as I mentioned earlier, their expiration date is through the end of 2022. Maryland, I believe, is through 2023. So there are states that had like more future expiration dates for their temporary telehealth policies. But a lot of policies have already expired. Temporary policies have already expired, such as the licensure relaxations that a lot of states did in response to COVID. So we will just have to see what happens. Like all states are in like their different spots on like what they're doing with the public health emergency and where they are and what they're keeping around. What are some state legislative trends that we are seeing? Because this is, again, like the federal government, another way for states to make things permanent is that they may do something administratively with their Medicaid program, deciding something, or they may be doing it through legislation. The big one is what to do after the PHE. Sort of the big areas that they're looking at are Medicaid and private payer changes. What we're also seeing like more recently is sort of more explicit directions on how to do documentation and record keeping, sort of like, what do you need to like gather from the patient as far as like informed consent before and having it in their record when you're using telehealth. And also telehealth standards for various professions. These are directing maybe licensure boards or oversight boards to have more specific guidelines on how their licensees are to use telehealth. So we're starting to see a little bit more of that too, which is kind of creeping in. Was not like a temporary telehealth policy change that we saw in response to COVID, but has been a result of what we're seeing changing policy as a result of like what has happened with COVID. So that's about it. It's still a little bit uncertain on what the exact landscape is going to look like once that PHE is declared over. Keep in mind, again, I'm recording this on July 6th of 2022. And as I mentioned earlier, the physician fee schedule for the following year, a lot of times comes out like during this month. It's not out yet as far as when I'm recording this video, but that could also have implications for what the post-PHE landscape will look like, because again, CMS makes changes in that physician fee schedule that will have like permanent impacts going forward. And also Congress may surprise us by passing a bill and having some telehealth elements in there, maybe making some of those temporary policies permanent as well too. So that is our CCHP website. I would encourage you, if you are interested in the information from a specific state or to keep track of anything that's going on in telehealth policy on the national and the state level, to go to our website, or also to subscribe to our newsletter. So thank you very much. I hope you found this video informative, and we will see you in the next one. Have a great day.